The race is on, and Max Verstappen recovered from his Q3 disaster to win the Miami Grand Prix with a superb drive from ninth on the grid, reasserting himself as the short odds World Championship favourite. But why couldn't teammate Sergio Perez hang on to the lead, and why was the order in the Ferrari, Mercedes, Aston Martin battle shuffled again? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us to answer those questions and more are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Mark Hughes. Well, Mark, are you going to demand a bombastic, big introduction in keeping with the Miami Grand Prix, or is the usual hello good enough?
No, I'd like the big bombastic introduction, please.
OK, well, we'll get LL Cool J in for the next one. You'll have to bear with us for now, but we'll go big for the next episode. And Scott, you're always lobbying for a bigger introduction, aren't you? So what did you make of the special pre-race presentations?
I didn't dislike them as much as I saw some people take issue with them, and I know they were unpopular with quite a lot of the drivers. But I do take the argument that they're no other sport does it on quite such a level. But I've been to countless football matches, and you have a PA announcer read out the starting lineup, and everybody cheers each driver's individual name. So it's not an enormous departure from what's seen in other sports. I think the pageantry is a bit bigger in the US sports. So I'm a big fan of basketball, and whenever I've been to NBA games, the announcement of the starting five players in particular, they come through and Guard of Honor style, and then like a big welcome entrance music kind of thing. So it is more in line with that. I think maybe. I don't think it's just specific to here. I think it'll be done at a few races, not just the US ones. It's just something different. I don't have a huge problem with it. I'm not saying it's my favourite way to build up to a Grand Prix by any means, but it's inoffensive as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, certainly some of the drivers don't like it because it disrupted the preparation, but I don't particularly mind it. It's one of those things, you don't have to have a really strong extreme feeling on everything, do you? But I guess with the event, it was in keeping with it, and I imagine that kind of thing is here to stay for certain races at the very least. Well, Mark, let's get into how the race was won. It's quite an interesting one here because Perez started on pole, led the race, and was on what seemed to be the right strategy. So how did Verstappen manage to win from ninth on the grid?
He took the ostensibly logical decision, because he was starting from P9, to begin on the hard tyre, and that's quite a normal thing to do when you're out of position, because you're going to be losing time getting past slower cars, and you want to sort of build up the gap once you've done that, and so you need a tyre with a longer range. But it wasn't expected to be as good a tyre as it turned out to be relative to the medium. And so he actually inadvertently, well, not inadvertently, but in choosing the sort of practical tyre for his grid position, his compromised grid position, he'd also, unknown, beforehand, put himself on the ideal combination of tyre, actually, because the medium proved to be a little bit delicate, especially on a first stint when you're full of fuel. So Perez couldn't really use the tyre, the medium tyre, as hard as he would have liked when he needed to have pulled out a gap. And the hard had virtually zero degradation, and it was only, even at its peak, only a couple of tenths slower than the medium. So within, very few laps, it was actually the quicker tyre. And the way that the strategies played out, because, Max did a long stint on it, and Perez did a shorter stint on it, it meant that Max was on the faster tyre for more of the distance. He was on the faster tyre for 79% of the distance, and Perez was on the faster tyre for 64% of the difference. So that sort of overcome that initial delay, which wasn't a very big delay, actually, that Max took in getting through the traffic and up to second place.
Yeah, that was the key thing for him, wasn't it? Making those gains early on, minimising the losses while coming through. But Scott, did you feel that also Perez had a bit of an underlying pace disadvantage as well? We did see that through most of practice and qualifying, except for that one crucial run in Q3.
Yeah, I'd not seen anything through practice or qualifying to suggest that Perez would hold a candle to Verstappen in anything approaching a straight fight. And I think he deserves credit for piecing it together when it counted in qualifying, given the difficulties he'd had earlier in the weekend. And ultimately, when you're in that Red Bull, if your bad weekends are so bad that you can still qualify on pole and finish second, then I think Checo will probably count that as a win. But there's a reason he couldn't win that Grand Prix when Max only started ninth. And it wasn't because Max Verstappen drove the greatest Miami Grand Prix in the history of Formula One races. It was because Max Verstappen was very good this weekend and Checo Perez wasn't quite as good as him. I think if Perez had been at the level with the car that he was in Jeddah and Baku, I think Perez wins that race. So I don't think there's really a question there. But the fact that there were parallels with Saudi Arabia in this race, Verstappen coming through, having to get into second, then try and chase down Perez in the lead. And the key difference was in Saudi, you were always waiting for that moment where Verstappen, really turned on the afterburners, went after Perez, passed him and won. You expected it to come and it never did. But what was different about this one is I don't know about the two of you, but for me there was an air of inevitability. It was when, not if, Verstappen would come past.
Yeah, it did feel that way, particularly as that first stint went on for Verstappen. What do you think, Mark? Do you think Verstappen would have won whatever the strategy? Would Verstappen have been able to win in Perez's shoes with the strategies being the same? I know it's always difficult to guess at that, but there did seem to be a pace difference as well.
Yeah, they did. And when, through the practices, he looked to have between 3 and 4 tenths on Perez. And although Perez did, as he quite often does, find quite a bit of time on his on that Q3 run that stood for pole, it was difficult to judge whether it was real or just track influence, because the track was getting faster. And we would only really have seen that with the comparison with Verstappen. Of course, we didn't get to see that. I suspect Verstappen just had a handy pace advantage anyway. And the circumstances of the way the tyre picture played out just helped him.
And the way the first 15 laps of Verstappen's race, just in general, because if you were charting your rise or in your mind's eye plotting out how you were going to go from 9th to 2nd, I think Max would have been incredibly generous to himself to have imagined pre-race that he would have had such a serene run in that opening stint. It was perfect. He could have lost ground at the start on the hard tyres, and he didn't. He was just making, it wasn't just, I'll make a place, 3 laps later, make another place. It was quick fire, a couple of places here, then that double move into turn 1. And it was one of those where just everything was coming together, because he was even catching people in the DRS zone and passing them in the DRS zone in the middle of the lap. So he'd lose a couple of tenths in the first sector behind them, but then he'd gain 5 tenths in the middle sector because with the DRS and the tow. So there was a point in the race where he was making progress in terms of position and track position, while also taking time out of Perez's lead. So it was just one of those where as soon as Verstappen had that clean run through the opening laps, that just charted a course to victory that I just don't think he ever looked like getting knocked off of.
Yeah, I think it's just a good example here. Perez had a good weekend, but Verstappen was just that little bit of a step ahead for the various reasons we've explained. But Scott, we have talked on recent podcasts about Perez's title hopes and the need for him to sustain his form. So what did the Miami weekend say about his chances?
It's not good that he couldn't win with Verstappen starting where he did. And if you can't win in those circumstances, he will struggle to stay in title contention, because Verstappen will have very few of those weekends where he is out of position and Perez is given such an opportunity. When that car is as quick as it is, I know that margin's not as great in qualifying, but it is the fastest car over 1 lap and miles the faster car over a race distance. Those 2 cars should be starting and finishing first and second in pretty much every Grand Prix. And when something happens to knock the other car out of that for whatever reason, then the other car needs to capitalise on it. And the best way I can put it is that if it was roles reversed today and it was Max starting first and Checo ninth, you're not even questioning who's winning the Grand Prix, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. So I just think this weekend's shown that Checo's peaks aren't the problem. It's those moments where he just cannot go with Verstappen, which he couldn't this weekend.
Yeah, it's kind of in line with what we were expecting. There will be weekends like this and a reasonable number of them. So it's down to Checo to find a way to change that pattern from recurring too much. Mark, business as usual with Fernando Alonso taking his fourth third place in 5 races for Aston Martin. Does this show the Aston Martin is probably the most consistent of that chasing pack, given Baku DOS troubles aside? It tends to avoid the ups and downs of Ferrari and Mercedes.
Yeah, I think it's got a better balance between qualifying pace and race performance. And that's just, I think, partly the configuration of the car. It's just, a better concept of car than either the Ferrari or the Mercedes. And I think it's just partly the way that they run it and the way that Fernando, helps direct the team into getting the perfect package for the weekend, really. And the way he used the car, the way we've seen it before from him this year. He doesn't take too much out of the tyres for quite a long time, and then he just applies the pressure and off he goes. He's away. Great performance again, and yeah, I think we're going to see many, many more third places behind 2 Red Bulls. I think that is the next best car after the Red Bull as a general package.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not quite enough in that car to take the fight to Red Bull, but there will be days, surely, when things go against Red Bull. So if Alonso keeps doing that, surely that long-awaited next win will be there. But Scott, he was having a lovely time in the race, wasn't he? Complimenting Lance Stroll's overtaking skills as he continues his Lance Stroll for future world champion campaign.
And also just a nice little, not so subtle flex of just how much in command of everything Fernando is, because he's so in control. He can afford to look at jumbotrons and work out what's going on elsewhere, and then radio over to the team to pass on his congratulations. You don't do that unless I think you want people to realise that you're capable of taking in that information and acting on it. It's that I think there's a little bit of that. I don't doubt the sincerity that was within it. I just don't think the reason for doing it was 100% to be a nice person to Stroll.
Well, as we've discussed before, Fernando Alonso's never one to let his brilliance stand for itself. He likes to find little ways to show that for some reason, and yeah, he's doing really well at the moment. So it's great to see him fighting up the front and having a good time, and that's certainly good for Formula One. Well, Scott, there was a new floor for Ferrari in Miami, which apparently did help, although the drivers are still talking about a peaky car. Carlos Sainz was 4th, Charles Leclerc 7th. I guess the obvious talking point is Leclerc's qualifying shunt and whether he was just being too aggressive in his approach.
Yeah, I think the crash itself started a few corners earlier. He'd having made a mistake on the first run in Q3 and therefore been on the back foot. He was then aggressive at the start of the second flying lap on the second run, and he just went a little bit deep into turn 1, missed the apex slightly, so he's on the back foot already right at the start of the lap, and I just think he overreached trying to make up ground for that. He just got a bit greedy on the inside curb through turn 7, just a bit too far over to the left. I think it caused the car to bottom out. And obviously the rear just snapped on him instantly, and did the very rare thing I would imagine the two of you noticed in his spin, where he almost had 2 spins in one, where he sort of spins off onto the runoff and then has like another little spin within it, which is what sends him backwards into the barrier. I think it's just I think Leclerc was. We know he likes to live on the edge, and that's where he does his best work. But sometimes he just gets that judgment slightly wrong. And I think here it was Baku. I think was a great example of Leclerc when he's sort of feeling comfortable in the car, confident in the car, and therefore just allows himself to take that extra risk because he can just gather it up. this was a slightly different part of that same spectrum, in that this time he was taking the risks to try to catch up a deficit. It was to try and, as he put it, do something special, take more risks, because he knows the car's not there. And I think, whether that was to qualify best of the rest or because he thought he had a chance of splitting the Red Bulls or whatever, he just asked a bit too much of that car, having lent on a very aggressive setup, in his words, which he knew would be hard to handle, but thought would pay off overall. So he was the architect of his own downfall, unfortunately, and he admitted it as such. But I can understand why people get frustrated when he then is very self-critical and says, "Oh, I can't do this. It must not happen again. It's unacceptable." And then 7 or 8 races later, he'll have something similar and say similar things. But I think that's just part and parcel of how Leclerc is as a driver. There is absolutely zero indication that he has any desire to change that approach, because he feels that the risk-reward ratio is still firmly in his favour.
Yeah, it's probably time for fine-tuning that. It was interesting, that curve, the left-hander, it was through that S just preceding turn 7. He's already taking more curve than most, and he took a chunk more on that lap. So perhaps just knowing when he's already sort of on that limit is something that will help him. But yeah, generally it pays off for him. Mark, obviously Ferrari struggled in the race. Tyres seem to be the problem again. Yeah,
Sainz went reasonably well on the medium, actually, in the first stint, but fell away badly on the hard in the second stint. Maybe he pushed a little bit too hard in trying to, he was being challenged by Alonso around the stops and pushed really hard on the outlap. So maybe that was a contributing factor. Leclerc was the other way around. He looked actually better on the hard than the medium. So very difficult to sort of pinpoint where it's going wrong when it's not the same between two cars, but it's definitely a better qualifying car than a race car. I think we can see that seems to be a pretty consistent pattern. You forgetting the comparison to Red Bull, just if you just look at comparison to the Aston Martin and the Mercedes, that seems to be the pattern. So yeah, Freddie Vasseur saying after the race that they're not really on top of it. They need to understand it, etc. Pretty much what Toto Wolff was saying yesterday about the Mercedes, how they don't have a full understanding of its shortcomings.
Just such a great counterpoint, isn't it, to how Red Bull are doing, that you've got Ferrari and Mercedes, the two teams that should be challenging, admitting to being surprised. But Scott, you were, I think, hearing from Leclerc after the race, he was genuinely slightly puzzled by aspects of the car as well. So this car is quite a capricious one.
Yeah, it was interesting, actually. We've heard before, haven't we, that the car's wind affected and particularly vulnerable to that. I think they feel that they do have probably the most sensitive car on the grid to wind. And it was really interesting hearing what Leclerc said, because he said that, he had a little mini debrief with Sainz before speaking to us. And when they talk about lacking consistency on the car, he said, it's not even corner to corner. It's in the same corner. There'll be a wild swing from an oversteer balance to an understeer balance, just depending on what happens through the corner. And he just said that makes it so difficult as a driver to gain confidence and to adapt your driving, because then when you switch from one set to a different compound, for example, you're second guessing what the balance shift is going to be, because the balance was shifting on the same lap, on the same corner before on the previous set of tyres. And it's just a bit all over the place. Leclerc said that it can be in a completely different window driving wise. And it just sounds like a real unknown how that car is going to react in certain situations. It's an unenviable position to be in, and you can see why it can be a situation like in Baku, for example, where you had one driver that was really confident in the car, one driver that wasn't, and there was 6 or 7 tenths between them, like an enormous deficit. That's just how punishing this car is. If you can't, if you're having to just adhere to those limitations rather than take them on, you're nowhere with it. And I can't remember a race performance from Leclerc that was as limp as this one. It really came across as he was having to drive properly within himself because the car just wouldn't let him do anything else.
Well, should we move from one troubled team to another one, Mark? In terms of single lap pace, this was the worst weekend of the season for Mercedes. The race was better. George Russell 4th, Lewis Hamilton 6th. But what do you make of the talk of the struggles to understand the car still?
They're just lost with this car. They have a big update coming in at the next race at Imola. Different front suspension and new bodywork. And they hope that that's going to sort of enlighten them a little bit. But the things that they expected of the car as they build up a picture of it from one track to the next over the season, it doesn't play out that way. And we saw this last year with the W13 as well. You'd have a race where it looked okay, and then you go to a different track, and that would seem to be suited to in a similar way. It would be asking similar demands of the car, and it just didn't perform. So, yeah, it's a very inconsistent car, but in a different way to the Ferrari.
It's one of those things that concerns me a little bit, because it's one thing to be off the pace, which Mercedes have been for the past year and a bit. But when they keep having these weekends where they admit to being slightly confused about the whole thing, that's slightly worrying. Obviously, Scott, the Imola upgrade is quite a big deal. It's not going to turn them into a Red Bull beater, but it is the new baseline, as Toto Wolff keeps saying. So I guess that's a big test of whether they really understand the things they need to make those changes.
Yeah, but I think there's something that Wolf said on the Saturday about removing variables that makes me think it's a little bit about ticking off what is right and wrong on the car rather than necessarily making it better. They're still adamant that there will be an immediate step forward rather than, I think, as I remember you asking Wolf back in Jeddah, I think it was, Ed, is it going to be a case of one step back to make several forward in the future? Because you've obviously got to recalibrate your baseline, basically, and then try and progress. And Wolf said there, didn't he, that no, it's performance now. And he reiterated that this weekend. But the fact that he felt the need to stress that it's also removing variables, finding out what doesn't work on the car and eliminating factors so that they can stop going down that road. It's almost like I don't know about the two of you, but I have the feeling that the racetrack might end up being a little bit of a live laboratory for them again for a while just so that they can actually affirm the direction they're going in. Because I think the way Mark described it in terms of this weekend, to them being lost, I think until we get some really concrete evidence to the contrary, that surely applies to the broader development situation that they're in at the moment. Do they actually know what that car needs? And have they actually done that to the car? I think Imola might be the first answers to that, but I'd be stunned if it's absolutely transformative and anything close to a definitive solution.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be the first step. We should say that in the race, both Hamilton and Russell had a pretty good time. It was slightly delayed for Hamilton because he was stuck in that DRS train early on, but then the race came alive for him a bit later on. So the car was decent in race trim, as much as it was pretty terrible in qualifying trim. So again, it still has reasonable performance in it, but they were still, Russell was over half a minute behind. So there's a very, very long way to go there. Scott, let's talk about Alpine. For the first time this season, they delivered the results needed, with Pierre Gasly 8th and Esteban Ocon 9th, so at the front of the mid-pack, which is where they need to be. How did they manage that amid the dilettantism that's apparently holding the team back?
Yeah, the very surprising machine gun round that CEO Laurent Rossi fired into his team over the course of the weekend in an interview with Canal Plus, the French television network. I always find it interesting when senior team figures feel the need to say that kind of thing in their own language, whether it's it's not hidden, it's on national television, it was always going to get picked up, but it just feels a little bit like I want to get this message out there, but I want to do it on my terms in my own little way. It's a bit weird. Not the first questionable decision I think Rossi's made as CEO there, but I think it was a weekend that they needed as a race team. Just really low fuss, get pretty much the maximum out of it. Not so much in qualifying, but definitely in the race in terms of the race result. I think double points finish is what they needed after the disaster that was Baku. And even though it wasn't a bumper points haul or anything like that, it felt like a bit more of a, right, this is where Alpine really are, which is really, in terms of pace, quicker than anything else in the midfield. Maybe not over one lap because, cars like the Haas are clearly capable of something great over one lap, but the Alpine's a better race car. That's undeniable. And actually, really I don't think that car is that far off that gaggle that's fighting for second when it's at its peak. I don't think it's I don't think it's a match for the Aston, but I don't think it's a million miles off the Ferrari or the Merc. Certainly, when the Ferrari and the Merc are struggling, I think they're vulnerable to the Alpine. So Rossi shot his mouth off and felt the need to question basically everything that his team's doing at the moment, which felt like a little bit of needless interfering, and I think it backfired. I don't think it went down very well in the race team at all. Probably didn't go down very well at Enstone either. But in terms of actually what they did as a job this weekend, I think in the context of their season and the car that they're working with at the moment, I thought it was absolutely fine.
Yeah, like I said, it's where they needed to be. Mark, it's worth having a quick word about Haas. Kevin Magnussen had one of his strong weekends with 10th, having qualified 4th. Nico Hülkenberg was flying until the second run in Q2 went wrong. So what explains their strong performance level?
The car is very good through medium and high-speed corners and interconnected corners, which is where quite a few of those midfield cars sort of fall down a little bit. When they have to be, turning for a long time, maintaining that consistent downforce seems to be a problem still for quite a few of them. But the Haas is pretty good there, and this was a good that first sector in particular really rewards that. And I think the drivers both got stuck in, liked the feel of the car, and were able to give a level of commitment that those in less predictable cars perhaps weren't able to.
Yeah, and Magnussen said they put the new floor on in practice and they didn't have to touch the setup a great deal. It felt good right from the start. So one of those weekends. But Haas are pretty consistent points throughout. Gunther Steiner was saying they're pretty happy with the consistency of scoring and that there should be some bigger paydays when more ahead hit trouble in future. Scott, shall we pay a quick visit to somewhere we've neglected so far this season? Valtteri Bottas made Q3 for the first time this year, and then he was on course for points for a good chunk of the race before fading to 13th. That's surely good reason to head to Valtteri Bottas sympathy corner.
Yeah, and I did really have a lot of sympathy for him after the race. Thought he did a good job in qualifying, very good right at the very end. And actually, I don't want to say that this is now becoming a bit of a trend, but when he's in that position, he did another good job at the start, didn't he? In terms of the launch, but also the way he attacked into turn one, and he ran in a good position early on as a result of all of that. But in his words, when I spoke to him after the race, I think the race just showed where that car really is. It's not a top 10 car. It's a treading water in the midfield at best car. He was fighting gravity from a very early point in his race. Just didn't have the time management, didn't have the speed, and we know that car's not the fastest in a straight line. He did his best, but there came a point late in that final stint where he was just in free fall. So I think it looked sadly inevitable once you saw how his stint lives were playing out compared to his immediate rivals and other cars in the midfield, that he was probably not going to be hanging on to a point in the way that, as we just said, Kevin Magnussen could in the Haas.
Yeah, and certainly I think the pace of that car was helped by fresh soft rubber in qualifying, and also Bottas on a smooth low grip surface. That's kind of his speciality. So I think he slightly flattered the car, and yeah, overall the race result was decent, but 13th isn't worth anything. But you and Alfa Romeo, that's about what was possible. Mark, McLaren were really strong in Baku last weekend and then were absolutely nowhere in Miami. So do you have any explanation for their struggles? Both cars were out in Q1. 17th for Lando Norris in the race, 19th for Oscar Piastri. Just appalling. Yeah,
not to the extent of the stark difference between the performance between those two venues. They were struggling. I mean, they struggle anyway with aero efficiency. They're not quick on the straights, so if they are, they have nearly no downforce. This track is less tolerant of that than Baku, which is not all that sensitive to downforce levels. So that's part of it. They were in trouble with the brakes. The feel of the brakes in particular is problematical. I think they're probably trying to limit how much the car moves to keep the aero platform stable, but it's given them real problems with brake and feel.
Yeah, and Andrea Stella was also talking about after qualifying, struggling a bit with points where they're not fully on throttle or fully on the brakes in those slower corners and longer load ones. They said they were struggling a bit in the castle section in Baku, for example, but it didn't affect the lap time so much. So those are actually quite classic McLaren problems of recent years coming through as well. So yeah, there's a lot of work there for McLaren to do. They're happy with the upgrade and the progress that's been made since Baku. This was kind of a track that exposed their weaknesses. But yeah, it shows how much work McLaren's got to do. And it doesn't take much of a swing in track characteristics to take you from the front of the midfield, which is where they were in Baku, to absolutely dreadful and basically the slowest car as they were in Miami. Well, as is tradition, we tackle questions from the Race Members Club in the final part of our race review podcasts. To join the Race Members Club and find out more about what membership offers, on top of the opportunity to throw questions at us on race day, head to therace.com and click on the race. So the first question we'll throw at you, Mark. It's from Simon Townend, who asks, can it really be that after all of last year and part of this year, Mercedes still don't really understand what is going on with their car? Are they actually positive the update will bring performance?
I don't think you can be positive when you've not fully understood what your current problems are. So, no, I think they're optimistic that it will head them in the right direction. But no, I wouldn't say they're brimming with confidence that this next thing is really going to make the difference. I think it's just still on an early part of a voyage of discovery, really. And yes, it's a continuation of the problems with last year's car. It's essentially the same car, but with the porpoising problem removed by a better rear suspension and by getting help with the floor reg change. It's those two things probably made them last year believe that all you had to do was sort out the porpoising and the aerodynamic potential of the car that they'd seen in simulation would be achievable. But it's been revealed that it's not, and they knew this before the season started. But as to exactly why, no, there's a lot of detail not pointing them all, not aligning in the same direction, and that's confusing them, and it's confusing the building up of the picture. But essentially, in hindsight, they've delayed themselves by 12 months through staying with this car, essentially. It's the same car with a different rear suspension.
Yeah, it's a lot to catch up on. Next question for you, Scott, from Ranveer Menon, who says, do the struggles Hamilton is having over one lap, namely about his discomfort in the car and the seating position, stretch back to last year as well, given the DNA of the W14 is similar to the W13? Or is there something new on the W14 which is causing his apparent disconnect on low fuel?
I think this is something that he's been working on since last year. He's talked about the elements of the car that are problematic, and obviously we know that the cockpit positioning, for example, was something that was moved forward on last year's car as part of these new regulations. It was all in connection with what they needed to do to get the shape of the bodywork the way that they wanted it. Last year, I think this was in an interview that Mark was part of. Lewis described the way you needed to drive the car as like creeping up behind a horse. The way you had to be so careful and cautious with it on corner entry. You couldn't startle the car. Basically, I think that's what he was trying to say. It didn't respond very well with sharp movements, and it's sort of the same again this season in that it's perceiving the movement of the car and trying to work out what it will respond to, and just not really having the confidence to lean on it, because as soon as you start doing too much to it, the car reacts very poorly. I actually think in Miami, I think he did have the edge on Russell for pace, but he was really unhappy with how they handled that final run in Q2. Felt that they were maybe a little bit too, don't want to say confident necessarily, but they just misjudged it. He felt that if they just got on with it a bit earlier, he'd have been able to run the outlap at his own pace, prep for the lap, nail the lap. Either car could have got knocked out in Q2 there. At one point, I thought both would. He didn't nail it in the way that Russell did. He paid the price, started lower down, did a good job after that. But you can tell that I think it's just a car that punishes either driver if they're not absolutely in this really, really narrow window of making it work.
The next question I'll take is from Jollifrix, who asks, for teams like Ferrari and Mercedes, who would be spending well above the budget cap if they were permitted to, at what point does the wind tunnel time they lose out on by finishing higher up in the Constructors' Championship become more valuable than the larger amount of prize money that it yields in their quest to catch up Red Bull? Well, the short answer on that one is that it doesn't. And that's not just because of the financial reward, which is significant for every position, but also because these are competitive entities full of people who want to beat whoever they can. Besides which, the effect of a position in the ATR is, while not zero, relatively mild. It's designed to be a gentle handicap system and isn't there to create a seesaw effect in terms of who is competitive. So I don't think teams are going to be throwing away championship positions to gain on the ATR. That's kind of a reward for underachieving, shall we say. Mark, the next question to you from Jeremy Husted, who says, are many media outlets giving Mercedes too much of a pass despite their continual struggles? It seems that if Ferrari or Red Bull had repeatedly failed at grasping these new regulations, there would be much more outrage. Instead, it's largely been continual excuse-making, not just from the Mercedes team, but also many in the media.
I don't think we're here to judge, really. I think we're here to report and analyse. I don't think I would be outraged if Red Bull had messed up their car, just as I'm not outraged that Mercedes has. But I wouldn't shy away from describing the shortcomings. I think that's the function of the media. It's not to be part of the fan base of cheering for your team and booing for the other team, or booing when your own team is not as good as you want it to be. It's just not. It's not a perspective from which I've ever followed the sport, and I don't think for many of us in the media, I think that's just not how we approach it. So it's not a case of being critical or excessively praising. I think it's just a case of describing and analysing, and that's it for me, really.
I think whenever we talk about what they've got wrong, that's less excuses. It's more things they've got wrong. Anything they've got wrong is fundamentally underachieving and something they've not got right. So I would have thought we've talked about that a fair bit, but certainly no question Mercedes are underachieving. Even Toto Wolff, everyone in the team would say it's not good enough. And I think that's the nature of Formula One teams. They're always setting themselves high standards and trying to deliver, but it is difficult. Scott, a question for you from Urban Strenchan, who says, do you think that Red Bull will start with team orders in the championship race so they make it easier for Verstappen since he is their main driver? Also, do you think that we can see Daniel Ricciardo replacing Nick de Vries at AlphaTauri?
I don't think Red Bull will go down the team orders route because I don't think they'll need to. I think as long as it gets to a point where Verstappen's just keeping Perez at arm's length, the situation will basically resolve itself. Where they need to be careful, and Christian Horner touched on this earlier in the weekend in a press conference, they just need to make sure paranoia doesn't creep into the fight, whether that's Verstappen feeling that he should or shouldn't be favoured, for example, or Perez feeling that he is or isn't getting a fair crack of the whip. As long as Red Bull can manage that, I think that's all they're going to worry about. As for Ricciardo, I think we've talked before about his prospects of getting on the grid next season. Apologies if you can hear, I've got a strange alarm that keeps beeping every now and again in my Airbnb in Miami. I think some kind of seat within the Red Bull fold is obviously the most straightforward option for Ricciardo, given he's part of the Red Bull family now. But I think he'll have his sights on something much more competitive than an AlphaTauri seat, so I don't really see that happening.
Yeah, we should note, difficult race for Nick de Vries. He qualified well, out-qualified Tsunoda, made Q2, but then made that mistake at the first corner, locking up and hitting Lando Norris. So a difficult day for him. Mark, question for you coming from a very, very different angle from Dave Langford, who says, with the drive to be carbon neutral, I think F1 should introduce something similar to IndyCar's system of moving the timing line back for qualifying before the pit entry, thus negating the need for an in-lap. Do you think this is something F1 would consider? F1 is all about marginal gains. This could be one.
Well, I mean, everything counts. It's not a bad idea. It's something to be considered, yes. Yeah. There's probably a little thing which will trip you up somewhere, but it's certainly worth looking at, I think.
The irony of that suggestion is that it would be done in the name of sustainability, you would imagine, but the championship's hybrid engines are probably the reason why it wouldn't work, because you need the in-lap, don't you, to help with the battery state of charge.
There you go. There's the little thing that would trip you up. That's it.
There's always something, isn't there? Always something. Scott, next question to you from Tom Bannister, who says, should F1 have one team that is dedicated to giving the previous year's F2 champion a race drive alongside an experienced driver, or should F2 change so that the F2 champion can defend their title the following year? My feeling is something needs to be done so the likes of Felipe Drugovich is not left without a drive in either series. It seems that unless you're affiliated with an F1 team, then it doesn't matter what you do in F2, you will not race in F1. They could use the 11th or 12th team slot for this.
I think it's difficult because as much as I agree that if you've won F2, you deserve a chance of some kind in Formula One. Drugovich has kind of got that with his Aston Martin role, but F1 doesn't operate on a one in, one out policy. It's not that every year there has to be someone that loses their drive, and unless you had that, you have no way of getting the guaranteeing the F2 champion a seat, for example. And if you had a team that was set up explicitly for that purpose, you know, what happens in future seasons? Once you've had 2 seasons worth of champions, that team's full. And where does that champion then go after that? Do you know what I mean? Like it's tricky to make something like that work. I think the reality is that the F1 grid at the moment is, I think, less reliant on pay drivers than it's ever been, and certainly in the modern era. And I think a lot of drivers are there on merit. I know that people will argue the likes of, you know, Lance Stroll with his familial connection is something, and there's always going to be questions over whether Logan Sargent's only on the grid because he's American or little things like this. You're never going to escape that. As long as you have a degree of success in junior categories and you've proven that you're not a no-hoper, I'm not saying that's the bare minimum. I'm not saying that you know that is all you need to be to get into F1. Of course, you should be a higher level than that. But like, there's nobody offensive on the grid at the moment, and the reality of motorsport and F1 is that it's not just about, you know, your results in one given season. So I'm actually okay with it how it is at the moment. It was particularly problematic when Oscar Piastri was nowhere near getting a race drive as an excellent rookie F2 champion, but he was at least on the books of an F1 team with an opportunity to go and do something and get on the grid in the future. And I'm happy with that as a compromise for now.
And the final question, which I'll take, is from Christopher Parrott, who says, Charles Leclerc, more like Charles Lecrash. And he adds, I won't hold it against you if you don't read that out. Well, it's you that said it, Christopher, so I was happy to read it. How big a blot on his reputation and the number of accidents Leclerc is having in 23 and in general? I saw a stat that he has had more accidents in the past 5 races than Mick Schumacher did in his whole career, and we know how that ended. And that's before you mention the high-profile errors in prior seasons. Surely he will remain a step below Verstappen and Hamilton pedigree as long as he is accident-prone. Well, we did touch on this a little bit earlier. And yeah, the short answer is there is a concern. He's a proper live wire driver, does incredible things on that knife edge and occasionally falls off it. I'd like to see him get that risk reward right once he's in a championship situation. I don't think that trying to overreach what the car can do is a particularly good argument for this happening too often, because part of the skill of a driver is judging what the maximum of the car is and not going over it. But he also gets a lot right, doesn't he? It's not like he's crashing every single time. That comparison to Schumacher, I think, particularly references those 3 significant crashes last year, the Jeddah one, the one in Monaco, and also that Suzuka practice one after the checkered flag, which were the 3 accidents that really counted against him in the mind of Haas when they were considering retaining him. But he did have other offs as well, and Schumacher never showed anything like Leclerc-style pace. So, yeah, I don't think that tells us a great deal. But yes, for Leclerc to prove absolutely he's in that Verstappen-Hamilton class, he does need to ensure he minimises the errors once in a title fight and maintains that speed with it. He's already superb, and that would make him formidable, and I think he will. But yeah, he needs to cut back the frequency a little bit. Well, thanks very much to Scott Mitchell-Malm and Mark Hughes for your insight. Head to therace.com and don't forget the hyphen loads to read there on the fallout from the Miami Grand Prix and all the news in the world of Formula One. Check out our other podcasts, including Bring Back V10s, which tells classic F1 stories, our IndyCar podcast, Formula E, and also check out our YouTube channel as well. Well, there's a 2-week gap before the next race with a triple header coming up, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.